August 1944, Normandy, France. Major Wilhelm Hartmann pressed his field glasses against his eyes so hard they hurt. His hands shook, not from fear, from disbelief. Through the smoke and pre-dawn darkness, he watched Canadian tanks rolling forward at impossible speeds. 720 tanks advancing through complete darkness under a new moon, moving faster than any manual said armor could move. The impossible was happening right in front of him. Hartmann was 42 years old. He had spent 20 years studying enemy tactics for German military intelligence. He knew how battles worked. He knew what soldiers could do and what they could not do. What he was watching through those field glasses could not be done. But it was being done anyway. The numbers made it impossible. For 2 months, Allied forces had been stuck in Normandy. British and Canadian troops were trapped fighting around Caen. 2,000 men died every single week. They gained a few hundred yards of bombed farmland for those deaths. American troops faced the same horror in the hedgerow country. Every field hid German machine guns. Every lane became a killing zone. The Allied advance was measured in yards, not miles. German defenders killed 3 Allied soldiers for every German casualty. Generals whispered the word nobody wanted to say out loud: stalemate. Every military expert agreed on one thing. Real leadership came from experience. Montgomery had fought at the Somme. Bradley had trained officers for decades. They had earned their authority through years of combat. The British especially valued this tradition. Officers came from the right families, attended the right schools. Combat experience was everything. That was what everyone believed. Now these colonial Canadians were trying something different, and it was working. Hartmann had written the intelligence assessment on Canadian forces 3 months ago. His report was clear. The Canadians were colonial troops, farm boys from a country across the ocean. They had no real military tradition, no famous generals, no prestigious military academies. Their commander was a man named Guy Simonds, who had been a furniture salesman before the war. A furniture salesman commanding an entire corps. The British generals made jokes about it. The German high command barely paid attention. These were not professional soldiers, they were amateurs playing at a war. The report sat in a folder in the bunker behind Hartmann. He had been proud of that report. Thorough, professional. Based on 20 years of experience analyzing enemy capabilities, every conclusion was logical, every assessment was sound, and every single word was wrong. Through his field glasses, Hartmann watched something he had never seen before. The Canadian tanks were not slowing down for anything. They moved through darkness at 25 kilometers per hour. Fast enough that German anti-tank guns could not track them properly, but it was coordinated. 720 tanks moving in 4 tight columns, each column exactly 200 yards wide. They navigated using colored tracer fire and radio beacons. Artillery fired ahead of them in rolling waves, but the tanks never slowed, never stopped. They crashed through German positions before defenders could react. German defenders stayed in their bunkers while the shells fell. That was doctrine. That was what soldiers were trained to do. Wait for the bombardment to stop, then man the machine guns before the enemy arrived. It had worked against the French. It had worked against the British. But when German soldiers climbed out of their bunkers to man their guns, the Canadians were already there. Already on top of them. Already past them. The timing left no gap, no chance to set up defenses. By the time German machine gunners reached their positions, Canadian infantry were shooting them from behind. Hartmann lowered his field glasses and checked his pocket watch. The attack began at 11:30 last night. It was now 2:30 in the morning. 3 hours exactly. Canadian forces had captured positions 6 miles deep into the German defensive system, positions that were supposed to hold for weeks. Previous operations took 3 weeks to advance 6 miles through these same defenses. The Canadians did it in 3 hours, in complete darkness. The bunker filled with the smell of coffee and cigarette smoke. Other German officers stood around maps, moving wooden pieces that represented units. A colonel pointed at the map and shook his head. The wooden pieces representing German defenders kept moving backward. Every 5 minutes, another position fell. Another piece moved. The line was collapsing in real time. A captain suggested that the Canadians got lucky. Maybe the darkness confused their own forces as much as it confused the Germans. Maybe this was just chance. Maybe it could not happen again. Hartmann said nothing. He had been watching for 4 hours. This was not luck. This was something else entirely. Something none of them understood. A messenger ran into the bunker. His uniform was covered in mud and his face was white. He handed a report to the general. The general read it and his jaw tightened. The report was from a regimental commander whose position had just been overrun. The commander described something strange. Every Canadian soldier carried a map, not just officers, every single soldier. Privates who were farm boys 6 months ago were reading maps and making decisions like officers. When their sergeant died, the corporal took over without missing a step. When the corporal died, a private took over. They did not need orders from above. They knew the plan. They understood the mission. They could think for themselves. This violated every principle of military organization. Soldiers were supposed to follow orders. Officers were supposed to think. That was how armies worked. That was how they had worked for centuries. European military academies taught this. It was fundamental. You could not trust common soldiers with complex information. They lacked the education and training. They would get confused. They would make mistakes. Proper military discipline meant clear chains of command and soldiers who obeyed without question. But the Canadians were different, and it was working better than anything Hartmann had ever seen. German defensive positions that should have held for days were falling in hours because Canadian soldiers adapted on their own. They found weaknesses without waiting for officers to tell them where to attack. They supported each other without formal orders. They moved like water flowing around obstacles, finding the path of least resistance automatically. Hartmann walked outside the bunker. The night air was cold and smelled like cordite and diesel exhaust. Artillery shells whistled overhead. He could hear tank engines in the distance. The sound was moving east, away from German lines. The Canadians were pushing deeper. By dawn, they would reach objectives that planning documents said would take 3 weeks to threaten. A full corps of colonial soldiers who were not supposed to be capable of complex operations were executing the most sophisticated armored assault of the entire war. Hartmann pulled out his field notebook. He opened to a blank page. His hand hesitated over the paper. What could he write? That his assessment was completely wrong? That 20 years of experience analyzing enemy tactics had failed to predict this? That farm boys from Canada were better soldiers than the professional armies of Europe? All of those things were true. All of those things were impossible to believe. But Truth did not care what he believed. He wrote one sentence. The Canadians do not fight like we expected. Then he underlined it twice. This was the beginning of understanding. The beginning of realizing that the rules had changed. That everything German intelligence thought they knew about colonial troops was wrong. That underestimating the Canadians was the biggest mistake the German military had made since the war began. And by the time they learned that lesson, it would be too late to do anything about it. Hartmann spent the next 3 days collecting every report about Canadian tactics. He interviewed German soldiers who survived contact with them. He read captured documents. He studied maps showing where Canadians attacked and how fast they moved. The pattern became clear. The Canadians were doing things that military textbooks said were impossible, and they were succeeding precisely because everyone believed those things were impossible. The core of the Canadian approach was something called a creeping barrage. Hartmann had seen artillery barrages before. Every army used them. You bombarded enemy positions for hours or days, then sent infantry forward after the guns stopped. The problem was timing. The bombardment stopped. Enemy soldiers climbed out of their bunkers. They set up machine guns. Then the attacking infantry arrived and got shot. The gap between bombardment ending and infantry arriving was where attacks died. The Canadians eliminated the gap. Their artillery never stopped. It moved forward. 983 guns fired in perfect coordination. The shells landed 100 meters in front of the infantry. Exactly 100 meters, not 90, not 110. Exactly 100. Then, after exactly 3 minutes, the guns adjusted their aim. The shells moved forward another 100 meters. The infantry followed at a steady walking pace. They advanced 100 meters every 3 minutes. If they moved faster, they would walk into their own artillery. If they moved slower, German defenders would have time to man their guns. The timing had to be perfect, and it was perfect. Hartmann did the mathematics in his notebook. 100 meters every 3 minutes meant 2,000 meters per hour. The creeping barrage could sustain this pace for hours. The infantry never stopped advancing. German defenders faced a choice: stay in bunkers and let the enemy pass, or come out during the bombardment and die. Either way, the position fell. The Canadian method turned right defense into a trap. Every defensive position designed to stop attacks became a place where German soldiers could only hide or die. But the creeping barrage required something extraordinary. It required every artillery crew to adjust their aim at exactly the same moment. It required infantry to maintain perfect pace across kilometers of battlefield. It required split-second timing between thousands of men who could not see each other through smoke and chaos. Military experts said this level of coordination was impossible in combat conditions. Communication broke down in battle. Units got separated. Timing fell apart. That was why no army had ever tried this at scale. The Canadians made it possible through preparation that bordered on obsessive. Hartmann obtained a report from a French observer who had visited Canadian training areas. The Canadians practiced their attacks 50 times before executing them once. They built full-scale replicas of German positions using wood and tape. Every soldier walked through the practice attacks over and over. They memorized the timing. They learned the terrain. They knew exactly where they needed to be at every moment. By the time they attacked for real, the movements were automatic. Muscle memory replaced thinking. The coordination looked impossible, but it was just the practice repeated until it became natural. The second innovation was even more radical. The Canadians gave maps to every soldier. Detailed maps showing enemy positions, artillery targets, routes of advance. In German and British armies, only officers received maps. Common soldiers followed their officers. If the officer died, the unit often stopped functioning. Orders came from above, and soldiers obeyed. That was proper military structure. That was how discipline worked. The Canadian approach inverted this completely. Every private carried the same information as his colonel. Every soldier understood the overall plan. If an officer fell, the next man in line took over without hesitation, because he already knew what needed to happen. Canadian units could function without officers. They made decisions on their own when circumstances changed. This decentralized command meant Canadian forces adapted faster than any opponent could react. German officers found this concept disturbing. Hartmann interviewed a major who had been captured near Caen just weeks earlier. The major described watching Canadian privates study maps during breaks in combat, reading maps like they were books, discussing tactics like they were officers. The major kept saying it was wrong. Soldiers should not question. They should not think. They should follow orders. But those thinking soldiers had captured him and destroyed his entire battalion in less than 2 hours. The British High Command hated the Canadian methods at first. Montgomery himself called Simonds's plans fantastically complicated and impossibly risky. British armor doctrine said tanks needed infantry protection. Tanks should move slowly. Tanks should wait for support. The Canadians ignored all of this. They sent tanks racing forward at top speed with infantry riding inside armored vehicles behind them. British experts predicted disaster. Instead, the Canadians broke through German lines faster than anyone thought possible. One British officer supported the Canadians when others wanted them to follow conventional doctrine. General Harry Crerar commanded the 1st Canadian Army and fought to give Simonds the time and resources he needed. When British staff officers complained that Simonds was delaying attacks to train his men properly, Crerar defended him. "Let the Canadians do it their way," Crerar told his colleagues. They have not failed us yet. That support bought Simonds time to prepare his troops correctly, time that saved thousands of lives later. What Hartmann had just witnessed was an operation the Canadians called Totalize. The attack had begun the previous night at 11:30. He had been watching it unfold in real time for the past 3 hours. The Canadians had attacked at night, with 720 tanks in close formation, without infantry walking alongside them. Everything about the attack violated armor doctrine that every military academy taught. Night attacks with armor were considered impossible. Tanks could not see in darkness. They would get lost. They would crash into each other. They would shoot friendly forces by mistake. Coordination would collapse into chaos. Every military manual agreed on this. Armor fought in daylight where tanks could see and maneuver. Sending 700 tanks forward through darkness was suicide. The Canadians made it work through preparation. They navigated using colored tracer fire, radio beacons, and compass bearings updated every 500 meters. Tank commanders practiced night driving for 72 hours straight before the attack. They learned to move in tight formation without lights. They learned to trust their instruments and their training. At 11:30 the previous night, under a new moon, 720 Canadian tanks rolled forward through complete darkness. German defenders were sleeping. They expected attacks at dawn like always. By the time they understood what was happening, Canadian armor was already past their first defensive line and shooting them from behind. The results made Hartmann's blood run cold. Canadian forces advanced 6 miles in 4 hours. Previous operations took 3 weeks to cover that distance. German casualties were 3 times higher than usual because defenders were caught completely unprepared. Canadian casualties were 1/3 of what they had been in daylight attacks. The numbers proved that the impossible tactic worked better than the proven ones. The Canadians had done what experts said could not be done, and they succeeded precisely because German defenders believed it could not be done. Canada had a population of only 11 million people. The entire British Empire had 450 million. The United States had 130 million. Yet Canada put 1.1 million people in uniform. 1 out of every 10 Canadians served in the military. That percentage was higher than any other allied nation. They achieved more with fewer resources because they used every resource with perfect efficiency. Nothing was wasted. Every shell counted. Every soldier mattered. Every attack was planned down to the minute. Hartmann understood now what he was facing. The Canadians were not amateur colonials. They were professionals who had invented a new way of war. A way that made size matter less than skill. A way that made tradition matter less than innovation. A way that won battles through thinking instead of just fighting. And the German military had no answer for it because they had never prepared to face an enemy like this. By November 1944, Hartmann had collected enough data to understand the full scale of what was happening. He compiled statistics from captured German unit reports across the entire Western Front. The numbers told a story that High Command did not want to hear. In sectors defended against British forces, German officer casualties ran at 12% of total deaths. Officers were targeted like anyone else, but they died at roughly the same rate as enlisted men. In sectors facing American troops, officer casualties were 15%, slightly higher but not dramatically different. In sectors facing Canadian troops, officer casualties jumped to 38%, more than 3 times the rate of British sectors, more than twice the American rate. Canadian forces were deliberately hunting German officers, and they were terrifyingly good at it. The pattern was consistent across every German division that faced Canadians. Most officer deaths happened at ranges beyond 600 meters. Normal infantry combat rarely exceeded 300 meters. Machine guns were effective to 500 meters. But 600 meters and beyond was sniper range. The Canadians had developed a sniper doctrine that turned individual riflemen into weapons of terror. German soldiers captured near Cassino told interrogators about shooters they never saw. Men who could kill from distances that seemed impossible. One German private swore a Canadian sniper shot his corporal through a 30-centimeter window opening from across a fog-filled valley. The shot was impossible, but his corporal was dead anyway. German units started requesting transfers away from Canadian sectors at 3 times the normal rate. Soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviets said they would rather go back to Russia than face the Canadians again. Russian soldiers were brave and numerous but predictable. The Canadians were something else. They attacked at unexpected times. They moved faster than doctrine said was possible. They appeared where they should not be. Fighting them felt like fighting ghosts who could kill you but could not be killed back. Wehrmacht patrol frequency dropped by 50% in areas where Canadians operated. German commanders ordered patrols because patrols gathered intelligence. But sending men on patrol into Canadian sectors was sending them to die. Patrols that went out at night rarely came back. Patrols that went out during fog never came back. German soldiers started refusing patrol duty. Officers had to order specific men by name because no one would volunteer. The Canadians had made the ground between the lines so dangerous that moving through it was suicide. In December 1944, German High Command issued a special directive. Hartmann saw a copy marked secret and urgent. The directive was distributed to all units facing Allied forces in France, Belgium, and Holland. It specifically named the Canadian formations and warned about their tactics. The document used the phrase Selbstmordkommando, suicide squad. German intelligence officers who wrote the report thought the Canadians fought like men on suicide missions because they attacked with such aggression and speed that they seemed to have no regard for their own safety. The directive ordered German units to prepare defenses in depth, to focus fire on lead vehicles to create roadblocks, to avoid static positions where Canadian armor could outflank them. Every recommendation was defensive. The directive never suggested how to defeat Canadian attacks. It only suggested how to survive them and slow them down. The directive had an unexpected effect. German units began withdrawing before Canadians arrived. Commanders requested permission to pull back rather than defend in place. They feared being trapped by the fast-moving Canadian columns. One regimental commander wrote in his report that holding ground against these tactics was impossible because by the time his guns engaged the enemy, half the Canadian force was already behind his lines. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers were trained to defend. They were good at it. But the Canadians made defense feel futile, made it feel like waiting to be killed. That feeling broke units faster than bullets did. Hartmann documented everything in reports that went up the chain of command. He included comparison data that showed how different Allied forces performed against the same German defensive positions. At Belleau Wood, American Marines attacked German positions using traditional tactics. They advanced in waves across open ground. German machine guns cut them down by the hundreds. It took the Americans 3 weeks to capture the wood, and they lost 9,000 men doing it. Canadian forces faced similar defensive positions in the Scheldt estuary. They captured their objectives in 6 days with less than 3,000 casualties. The difference was not courage. American Marines were incredibly brave. The difference was method. The Americans fought the way military academies taught. The Canadians fought the way that actually worked. In Italy, the British 1st Armored Division tried to break through Gothic line defenses using careful doctrine-approved tactics. They advanced slowly. They waited for infantry support. They followed the rules. They lost 96 tanks covering 8 miles in 9 days. The Canadian 5th Armored Division attacked the same defensive system using high-speed aggressive tactics that every expert called reckless. They lost 19 tanks covering 23 miles in 2 days. The comparison made Hartmann sick. His own side was losing because they followed rules while the enemy won by breaking them. Captured German documents told the story from the front lines. A report from the 12th SS Panzer Division described fighting near Caen. The night attack by massed armor was completely unexpected, the report stated. Forward positions were overrun before defensive fire could be organized. Then came the sentence that Hartmann underlined in red ink. This Canadian commander understands armored warfare better than any British or American general we have faced. The report was classified secret. It was meant only for German eyes. It was not propaganda. It was a professional military assessment from elite troops who had fought across Europe. They were admitting the Canadians were better. SS General Kurt Meyer commanded one of Germany's most feared divisions. He was known as Panzer Meyer, a legend in the Wehrmacht, a man who had fought on every front and faced the best the Allies could send. Years after the war ended, Meyer wrote a memoir. Hartmann obtained a copy in 1958. Meyer devoted 3 pages to the Canadians. He called them the most dangerous opponent he encountered. He described Simonds, the Canadian Corps commander, as ice-cold and calculating. He said fighting the Canadians was like playing chess against someone who thought 3 moves ahead. Coming from Panzer Meyer, that assessment meant everything. The sound of Canadian attacks became legendary among German troops. Veterans who survived described the roar of hundreds of tank engines running at full speed, louder than artillery barrages. The smell of diesel exhaust mixed with cordite hung so thick in valleys that visibility dropped to 50 meters. Tanks fought with hatches open despite the danger because the heat inside became unbearable after an hour of combat. Sweat-soaked uniforms even in freezing weather. The sensory overload was intentional. The Canadians understood that overwhelming the enemy's senses was as effective as overwhelming their positions. German soldiers learned to fear specific sounds. The whistle of Canadian artillery had a particular pitch because they used different fuses. The engine note of Canadian tanks was distinct from American or British vehicles. Experienced German troops could identify Canadian units by sound alone at night. And when they heard those sounds, they knew what was coming. Some units broke and ran before the Canadians even arrived. The reputation alone was enough to shatter morale. By spring 1945, the pattern was complete. The Canadian Second Corps had become the spearhead of every major Allied offensive. When British and American forces needed a breakthrough, they called for the Canadians. From August 1944 to May 1945, Canadian forces led every significant advance. At Amiens, they broke through 5 miles of German defenses in one day. At the Scheldt, they cleared waterways the Germans thought were uncrossable. At Cambrai, they liberated a city occupied for 4 years. Every attack followed the same pattern: detailed planning, thorough preparation, perfect execution, Germans defending, Germans retreating, Germans surrendering. The statistics Hartmann compiled were crushing. Canadian forces captured over 8,000 German prisoners in the final 9 months of war. They destroyed more than 400 German fighting positions. They advanced over 200 miles through terrain everyone said was impossible for armor. Their casualty rate per mile gained was half what other Allied forces suffered. They accomplished more with less because they wasted nothing. Every attack counted. Every soldier mattered. Every bullet hit its target. The unexpected consequence was strategic. The Canadians were too valuable to use normally. They became shock troops, the formation you sent when everything else failed, the unit you called when the impossible had to be done. That role cost them. They fought in every major battle. They took every hardest objective. Their casualties would have been devastating except that their methods kept casualties lower than conventional tactics. They saved themselves through skill, even while being thrown at the worst positions. German intelligence learned to track Canadian movements obsessively. Where the Canadians went, major attacks followed. Allied commanders used this. They created fake Canadian deployments. British units wore Canadian uniforms. False radio traffic suggested Canadian Corps was moving to quiet sectors. German commanders panicked and pulled reserves to defend against attacks that never came. The Canadians had become so dangerous that even rumors of their presence changed German strategy. They won battles without fighting simply because the Germans feared them too much to think clearly. Hartmann understood the lesson too late. You cannot defeat an enemy by underestimating them. You cannot win by following old rules against opponents who invent new ones. You cannot rely on tradition when facing innovation. The Canadians proved all of this with blood and mathematics, and by the time the German military learned to respect them, Germany had already lost the war. The war ended on May 7th, 1945. Germany surrendered. The fighting stopped. Hartmann survived. He was one of the lucky ones. Millions of German soldiers died. Millions more spent years in prisoner of war camps. Hartmann went home to a country that did not exist anymore. Germany was divided. Cities were rubble. The Nazi government that started the war was gone. Everything had changed. Hartmann spent the next 13 years doing something unexpected. He became a military historian. He studied the war he had just fought. He analyzed why Germany lost. He wrote papers and gave lectures to the new German military being rebuilt under Allied supervision. In 1958, he published a book. The title was simple: The Canadians, A Study in Underestimation. The book was 347 pages of detailed analysis. It examined every major Canadian operation from Vimy Ridge in 1917 to the final advances in 1945. The central thesis was uncomfortable but undeniable. The German military underestimated the Canadians at every stage of both world wars. That underestimation cost Germany thousands of lives and contributed significantly to losing both conflicts. Other German officers who survived the war agreed with Hartmann's assessment. When Allied researchers interviewed Wehrmacht generals about the most effective enemy forces they faced, Canadian units appeared consistently in the top 3. Some rated them as the single most tactically competent force in Northwest Europe. General Heinrich Eberbach had commanded Panzer Group West before being captured. He knew armored warfare better than almost anyone alive. His assessment was devastating for other Allied commanders. If the Allies had 6 generals like Simonds, the war would have ended in 1944. He understood that victory requires ruthless calculations, not inspiring speeches. Most generals want to be loved by their men. Simonds wanted to bring his men home alive, even if they hated him for how he did it. The lessons Hartmann documented did not stay buried in history books. Military academies around the world began studying Canadian tactics. The United States Military Academy at West Point added courses on Canadian operations in the early 1950s. Operation Totalize became required study for all armor officers. British staff colleges at Sandhurst analyzed Canadian navigation systems and coordination methods. The principles that Currie and Simonds developed became foundational texts for understanding modern combined arms warfare. The Soviet Union paid particularly close attention. The Frunze Academy in Moscow obtained detailed reports about Canadian tactics through intelligence channels. Soviet military theorists translated operational plans and made them required reading for officers commanding tank divisions. The deep battle doctrine that the Soviets developed emphasized many of the same principles. Concentration of force at unexpected points. Attacks at unexpected times. Decentralized command that allowed units to exploit opportunities without waiting for orders from above. The Soviets never admitted they learned from the Canadians, but the similarities were impossible to miss. Israel studied the Canadians perhaps more carefully than anyone else. In the 1960s and 70s, Israeli Defense Forces officers analyzed every Canadian operation they could find documentation for. They were building a military for a small nation surrounded by larger enemies. The parallels to Canada's situation were obvious. Small population, limited resources, could not afford to lose. The Israelis adopted Canadian principles wholesale: concentrate armor at unexpected points, attack at unexpected times, accept calculated risks to minimize overall casualties, train every soldier to think and adapt. These were pure Simonds, filtered through different circumstances but following the same cold mathematical logic. The physical innovations spread even faster than the tactical ones. The Kangaroo armored personnel carriers that Canadian engineers built in 6 desperate days in August 1944 became the template for every modern APC. The American M113 that carried soldiers through Vietnam was based directly on Canadian designs. The Soviet BTR series that equipped Warsaw Pact armies for decades followed the same basic concept. The Israeli Merkava tank included a rear compartment for infantry, because Israeli generals understood that armor and infantry must move together under protection. Every modern mechanized army in the world uses armored personnel carriers as standard equipment. They all trace back to those 76 kangaroos welded together in a field workshop in France. In 1952, NATO formalized what everyone already knew. The alliance needed doctrine for how member nations would fight if war came to Europe. Planners studied every major battle from World War II. They analyzed what worked and what failed. The conclusion was clear. Canadian aggressive breakthrough tactics were more effective than careful, methodical approaches. NATO doctrine officially recommended high-speed armored thrusts as the primary method for breakthrough operations. The methods that British generals called fantastically complicated and impossibly risky in 1944 became official NATO policy 8 years later. The validation continued decade after decade. In 1991, coalition forces attacked Iraqi positions in Kuwait using tactics that would have been instantly recognizable to any Canadian tanker from 1944. Armor advanced at high speed using night vision equipment. GPS navigation replaced colored tracer fire and radio beacons. But the operational concept was pure Simonds. Attack when the enemy cannot see you. Move faster than they can react. Overwhelm their decision-making cycle. The technology was 50 years newer, but the thinking was identical. Even in recent conflicts, the patterns persist. Ukrainian forces defending against Russian invasion in 2022 through 2024 used adapted versions of Canadian mobile defense concepts. Small, highly trained units making their own tactical decisions. Emphasis on thinking soldiers rather than obedient ones. Concentration of force at critical points, followed by rapid dispersal, accepting calculated risks to achieve objectives. The Ukrainians never claimed they were following Canadian doctrine, but military analysts recognized the similarities immediately. Yet the men who developed these revolutionary methods received surprisingly little recognition during their lifetimes. Guy Simonds, who commanded Canadian forces through the final year of the war, faced constant criticism from British superiors. They called his methods reckless. They said he spent Canadian lives too freely. But the numbers told a different story. Canadian forces under Simonds advanced further with fewer casualties than any comparable Allied formation. They accomplished in days what others took weeks to achieve. They broke through defenses that stopped everyone else. After the war, Simonds rose to the highest positions in Canadian military leadership. He became Chief of the General Staff from 1951 to 1955, then Chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee until 1960. He modernized Canadian forces to NATO standards. He introduced helicopter assault tactics years before Americans used them in Vietnam. He established professional military education that trained officers in systematic tactical thinking. Everything he touched became more efficient, more focused on results rather than tradition. Yet despite holding Canada's highest military positions for nearly a decade, he remained virtually unknown to the Canadian public. There were no Hollywood films about the icy Canadian general who terrified the Germans. No best-selling memoirs with dramatic stories. No ticker-tape parades or monuments. Simonds simply did his job, retired quietly, and faded from public memory while Patton and Montgomery became household names. German generals never forgot him, though. In interviews after the war, they consistently rated Simonds as the most tactically competent Allied Corps commander. Not Montgomery, not Patton, not any of the famous names that filled newspaper headlines. The quiet Canadian who had been a furniture salesman. German professional military officers who spent their lives studying warfare recognized excellence when they saw it. Their respect meant more than any parade or medal could, because respect from competent enemies is honest. They have no reason to flatter, no motivation to exaggerate. When your opponents fear you and study you and warn their troops specifically about you, that is the ultimate professional recognition. Hartmann understood this when he wrote his book in 1958. He devoted the final chapter to a concept he called professional fear. Real fear, he wrote, is different from propaganda or hatred. Real fear comes from competence recognizing competence. German soldiers feared the Canadians not because Canadians were cruel or brutal. German troops faced cruel and brutal enemies on the Eastern Front. They feared the Canadians because the Canadians were devastatingly effective. Because they did everything right. Because fighting them felt like fighting an enemy who was always 3 steps ahead. That kind of fear is respect wearing a different name. The lesson extends far beyond military history. The most effective people are often the least celebrated. Real innovation comes from outsiders who question assumptions instead of following traditions. Simonds was a furniture salesman. Before him, Arthur Currie, who commanded Canadians in the First War, had sold real estate. Neither came from prestigious military academies. Neither had famous family names. But they looked at problems with fresh eyes. They asked why things were done certain ways. And when the answers were because we have always done it this way, they tried something different. Large organizations with unlimited resources often fail at tasks that small innovative groups accomplish. The British Empire had 450 million people. Canada had 11 million. But Canada punched far above its weight because Canadians could not afford to be average. They had to be excellent, or they would be destroyed. That desperation drove innovation. That need to prove themselves pushed them to find better ways. The greatest advantage sometimes comes from having everything to prove and nothing to lose. The story of the Canadians in both world wars teaches something fundamental about human nature. Never underestimate people who have been underestimated their whole lives. They remember every dismissal. They remember every time someone said they were not good enough. And when they get their chance to prove themselves, they bring an intensity that comfortable people can never match. The Canadians were called colonials and amateurs and farm boys. German generals made jokes about them. British staff officers looked down on them. And the Canadians took every insult and turned it into fuel, into motivation, into a determination to be so good that no one could ever dismiss them again. Fear is the tribute that professionals pay to excellence. The Germans feared the Canadians more than any other Allied force. That fear, documented in classified reports and whispered in prisoner testimony and encoded in Wehrmacht directives, was the highest honor one soldier can pay another. It meant respect earned through competence, through results that could not be denied, through skill that could not be dismissed. The enemy's fear is more meaningful than any medal because it is honest, because it costs the people who give it something to admit, and because it proves that everything you sacrificed and everything you fought for actually mattered.